Michael spoke somewhat absently, having been stabbed in the arm with a knife, and having spent a few days in the hospital recuperating. He was fine. Ivy knew that it was nothing to Michael, who had been born to die, but it just hurt in her heart, 1,000 times more than the wound in her back. She fought back the urge to shed a tear, and said sullenly, "Yes, it's not a big injury. After all, you can even eat apples." Michael heard a few sour notes in Ivy's tone. It was jealousy that he didn't know what to say for a moment. "Don't go to afternoon practice. Get some rest. I'll talk to Jack." Ivy didn't argue with Michael anymore, she just nodded and said yes, but then she got up the idea of teasing him. She winked and said, "Michael, last time I twisted my foot, you didn't believe me when I said my foot hurt. This time I hurt my back. Why do you believe me?" Michael frowned unsmilingly, and Ivy continued, "How do you know I'm hurt, when you haven't looked?" Michael looked at her with lazily downcast eyes. "What, do you need me to lift it up and look at the?" Michael said as he reached down and pulled Ivy to his side, making a move to undo her jacket. Ivy was startled. It was broad daylight, and clear, and soldiers and officers in drill uniforms were walking around them, and some of the curious were glancing their way from time to time. Ivy was busy waving her hands. "It's true, it's true, it's all true. My back hurts, you let me go back and rest." "Okay." Michael saw that his purpose had been achieved and withdrew his hand. "Go, get some rest, train well tomorrow. I'll be at all of your trainings from now on." Michael drove the person all the way down to the dormitory floor and watched Ivy go up the stairs before he turned to leave. Ivy lay on her back, her freshly rubbed back burning and aching, and her mind dazed and confused, and she fell asleep, just like that. Waking up again, Sumian and Sophia and the girls are back. Mian was carrying something in her hand, saw Ivy looking at them, and excitedly ran to Ivy's bed. "Sister, I brought you some rice." Mian said while putting the lunch box on the table next to Ivy's bed. Ivy got up from her bed a little puzzled. Since when did the troops get to bring their meals out of the cafeteria? Mian to Ivy squeeze eyebrows. Michael told the people in the cafeteria, "You are injured, it is not convenient to eat in the cafeteria. I say you this prick, Michael is quite concerned about you, right?" Ivy was just about to reply when the door suddenly slammed. It turned out to be Xingyu, who came back and frowned a bit unpleasantly when she heard that a few of them were talking. Ivy had always known that Xingyu didn't like herself. Sumian and Sophia also understood. The dormitory, which was still somewhat lively, suddenly became silent. The training went on as usual, and Michael showed up more often than he had before, but it was still not common to see him at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the military training. Michael is the main person in charge. In addition, he has to keep an eye on the special brigade side of the training. The good thing is that the special brigade training place is not far away from the military training where the training field. He has to go back and forth a few times a day, and sometimes have to take some other tasks, but also is busy and cannot be separated. Jack and Ethan and Oliver, the squad leaders, were a little fearful when they saw how hard Michael was coming, especially Jack, the one who took Ivy's class, had a bitter face every day, feeling even more bitter than they, the cadets in military training, worrying that Ivy, the prick, didn't know what she was going to get up to yet. But Ivy do not know how, suddenly changed sex, every day training up very hard, and no longer engage in things, and occasionally have some movements do not do well or is not standard. They are also very quickly change over. Jack was finally a sigh of relief. Ivy rarely spoke to Michael these days. Instead, she struck up a conversation with Jack from time to time, inquiring what kind of injuries Michael had sustained earlier and whether they were serious. Yet Jack also said they weren't major injuries, exactly as Michael had said. The scorching sun, the training ground of people sweating, they gradually mastered the skills of more quickly and safely creep forward. Walking front step is more and more imposing. The level of target shooting has also improved a lot, and there are very few people complaining again. In the afternoon of this day, the training was creeping. After a few days of recovery, Ivy's back injury has been a lot better. In fact, creeping forward is not so difficult. Just that day when training, she has been thinking of other things in her mind, only to zap herself, and now she does it smoothly enough, and also steadily. The speed is getting faster and faster. Michael also happened to be in this afternoon, dressed in full camouflage, his hands in his pockets, the tip of his tongue on his palate, watching the people not far away creeping on the ground one by one, and that included the girl who had been a pain in the ass. A voice, clear and flushed with some tenderness, rang out across the training ground. Michael. Everyone's eyes were drawn to it, and that included Ivy, that there aren't many girls in the army in the mountains of this Washington suburb, except for the female cadets in military training at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Came none other than Grace, whom Ivy had seen at the hospital that day. Grace was wearing a light blue lace dress with 7-centimeter lambskin heels, formal as if she was going to be on the show at any moment, set off by a group of camouflage-clad female cadets. That Ivy smiled, not expecting to meet Grace here, too. Michael hadn't expected Grace to come into their troop, and he nodded somewhat politely to Grace, politely with a touch of detachment. The Grace doesn't care much, smile sweetly at Michael. Look what I brought you. The Michael was still in that state of mind, just waiting for Grace to take it down a notch. Grace shook the insulated lunchbox in her hand. My grandfather said that you have been injured, you should replenish more blood. I stewed soup today, thinking that the food in the army is not very good. It's a kind of extra meal for you. Michael frowned and said coldly, my unit eats very well. The now Grace was a little embarrassed. She looked around her. The class that Jack had taken was all girls, and they were all staring at them as if they were gossip. It's a good thing Grace is in the media business and has a lot of exposure to people. Scenes like this are nothing to her. She begged in a somewhat pathetic manner, I boiled this soup all morning and drove nearly 2 hours to get it here. Try it, she said. Her tone was soft, with a few sobs, and she called for a less than favorable refusal. The Michael reached out and picked the thing up and called out, Jack. Jack trotted all the way over to Michael, handed Jack what was in his hand, split it with Ethan and Oliver at night. You guys have been leading military training hard these past few days, you need to make up for it. He said it as a matter of course, without feeling the least bit apologetic about it. Grace, a little aggravated, looked at Michael dismally and said, this is what I've been boiling for you. The Michael nodded, I appreciate your feelings, don't come over in the future, this side is so far away and remote, driving is too tiring, on the road is also not safe. Grace bit her lip and her eyes rolled back in her head, wondering what she was thinking about. That after a long time, she pulled out a somewhat forced smile, it's fine, anyway. I don't have any work assignments in the past few days, it's still idle at home, it's just like taking a break. The air in the suburbs is quite good, well, if they like it I'll make it for them next time. After saying that, Grace turned her head and casually surveyed the training ground. Suddenly she saw a familiar figure. At first she thought it was a blur, then she fixed her eyes to take a closer look. That person in camouflage, wasn't it Ivy? She asked Michael, a little surprised, why Ivy was here. The Michael replied blandly, the Foreign Office is in our military training here, and it just so happens that I'm leading the. Grace's heart was a little sore and swollen, but she acted as if nothing had happened. I'm going to go say hello to Ivy. Ivy had seen Grace long ago, and she wasn't at all surprised when Grace came toward her at this point. The crowd, however, found it strange that Grace smiled at Ivy. Ivy smiled back at her. There's Grace. Grace nodded and, well, made some soup and brought it over to Michael, with a touch of willful braggadocio and intimacy in her tone. That's Grace's usual tactic. Ivy laughed. He didn't seem to like the soup very much. I've got training, I won't talk to you. She made a turn, and crept back down into the barbed wire fence, and for a moment, the crowd was confused. This woman who brought the soup was Michael's girlfriend. And this woman and Ivy knew each other. Michael's nonchalant attitude toward Grace, and Ivy knew that Michael probably wasn't interested in Grace for more than a few moments. Although she had felt a little bit astringent in her heart when she saw Grace peeling an apple for Michael at the hospital earlier, she completely let go of her heart when she saw today's scene. Grace was so bored that she finally walked back to Michael and stood side by side with him. She had specially picked out a modest and dignified dress today, and she had attracted the attention of many young men all the way into the camp, but Michael, with his eyes fixed on the training ground, didn't even glance her way, and she was so happy to see him. Grace was a little disheartened and stayed on the training ground for a while, telling Michael that she had some business to attend to, and left. At the evening meal, Ivy, a prick who hadn't been in trouble for days, suddenly reappeared at Michael's table. Jack, Ethan, and Oliver, though they were drinking Grace's soup, were somewhat unappetizing, and if it had been usual they would have made a scene at Michael's, saying that his sister-in-law's soup was so good. But today it seems that Michael seems to have no interest in this Grace who has come to their unit a few times. Alas, even the political commissar thought that this deal might work out, and I don't know how it came to be that way. And to add to their horror, Ivy's messed with Michael again. Ivy sat down directly across from Michael, lifted her chopsticks, and tapped Michael's bowl on the hay. "Grace is so nice to you, she came all the way here to bring you soup, and you didn't even thank her, you even gave it to someone else." The 3 squad leaders at the same table couldn't help but wince when they heard that. Only Ivy would dare to provoke their chief of staff like that. Michael glanced up at Ivy, the warning somewhat obvious in the stern look that Ivy received a look from him and stopped talking to him, turning her head to herself and looking at Jack and the other 3, with a smile on her face. "How's the soup?" Although Jack is Ivy's class president, but privately call her Ivy sisters, at this time even more shocked to look at the other 2 people, the 3 of them nodded and shook their heads together. It was okay. Ivy didn't really want to hear them say whether the soup was good or not, but she looked at Michael with a smile and said, "If it's good, then next time Grace sends me some soup, I'd like some." Michael buried his head in his eating motion, reached his left hand up to the table and put it in front of Ivy, his index finger slightly flexed, knocked on her side of the table. "Eat honestly, if not, continue to go to the playground to run laps." The Ivy, who was full of energy just a moment ago, suddenly wilted, and she gave a low, oh so subtle cry, and obediently bowed her head to eat, and after a while, but Michael's low voice suddenly rang in her ear, with some explanation, "Don't worry, Grace won't even come here again," and Ivy raised her eyes in dismay, only to see Michael with his bowl of food, heading out the door with the 3 squad leaders, with no intention of waiting for her. After the evening's training was done, Xingyu started her language class in the dormitory as usual, mouthing the words. A few others didn't put so much pressure on themselves as she did, that is, they just listened to the foreign language radio or played with their cell phones for a while. However, the training was stressful and they soon fell asleep. It was a little chilly that night, a cold, whistling wind beat against the window, and after a while the rain poured down, and Ivy tossed and turned in her bed. She was tired, but the noise outside the window made it hard for her to sleep. Another clap of thunder was followed by the long blast of a bugle, accompanied by Jack and a few other squad leaders shouting the command to assemble downstairs. The several other people in the house had not slept well, and at this time they were all awakened, and at first they did not believe that a muster was really being shouted, and thought that they had heard it wrong. After all, they hadn't had an emergency assembly in the middle of the night for as long as they'd been in military training. When the second trumpet and shout came, the girls realized that it was really time to assemble. The Ivy practically rolled out of bed and dressed with 7 hands. Jack had said before the start of military training that if there was an emergency assembly in the middle of the night, everyone was to be downstairs in 3 minutes or less. The Ivy had always been a slow worker, and it was hard for her to get dressed in 3 minutes. Not just her, most of the people to military training is the same. Everyone ran downstairs. Not only overtime, grooming are not very neat, some hats are not wearing, some wear crooked, some belts are not tight. In short, all sleepy-eyed, lazy stand there. The whole team has no spirit to speak of, and the team is not a little bit of spirit. Just then, a man in camouflage and a military cap strides over to it was none other than Michael. Ivy had been to Michael's dormitory, a bit of a distance away, and now that the rain was so heavy and pouring, it was amazing that he just walked on, with a firm, angular gait, letting the rain hit the brim of his hat and drip down the brim of his hat. Michael stood in front of the group and frowned slightly at the listless individuals as he yelled out, "This is how you do military training." Some buried their heads. Some whispered, and Michael raised his voice again, "Is this your military appearance? Is this your military discipline?" Michael walked up to the first row of cadets and began pointing out the irregularities and errors in their dress code. When he reached Ivy's face, he suddenly called out, "Ivy." There was a slight coolness and cold hardness in his voice, and he was a man who, when in training, had always said that. Ivy replied, reflexively, "Where's your hat? Why's your belt so loose?" And this caller Ivy had never been reprimanded like that in public before. Her father John was serious on the outside but a loving father at home. Rose was more detached from her and naturally seldom spoke to her like that, and Michael, who was her boyfriend once upon a time, would never have spoken to her in such a tone of voice. Fortunately, Ivy turned her mind to understand. This is military training. Michael is their main instructor. This is what he has to do. But understand, Ivy is still a little bit aggravated, tears in the eyes, and the rainwater flowed out. Looking at Ivy's aggravated look didn't make Michael feel any better, and he was suddenly a little annoyed that he raised the volume. Did you hear that? Ivy was still looking at him with teary eyes and Michael sighed helplessly. He raised his hand and looked at his watch, counted the time and said to everyone, "You have 5 minutes, go back and reorganize your dress code, meet downstairs in 5 minutes, you hear me?" Everyone answered together, then they all dispersed and ran to their dormitories, one faster than the other. Ivy also do not know how. A little blindfolded standing, Soo-mi-yeon walked 2 steps to see her, back to pull her, she still did not respond. Soo-mi-yeon thought that Ivy was going to lift the bar with Michael again, so she had to whisper to her, "Sister, then I'll go up first, you also come up quickly." The Ivy still stood frozen as if she hadn't heard Soo-mi-yeon's admonition. Soo-mi-yeon sighed and went upstairs with Sophia in one piece. The Michael looked at Ivy, too, as the pouring rain lapped at the two of them. It was nothing to Michael, but Michael looked at Ivy all drenched. And something in his heart didn't feel right with everyone else. Gone, Michael put away the air he'd had earlier and spoke to Ivy in a softer tone than he had earlier. Get up there and get your clothes in order. Remember to put your hat on." Ivy bit the corner of her mouth, opened it, and finally said nothing, walking slowly towards her dormitory. The Michael looked at her back, then up at his watch, 3 minutes to go. Entering the dormitory building, Ivy started rushing towards her dormitory as if she had come to a realization. And when she arrived she saw that her roommate had already changed most of her clothes, and she quickly changed as well. This time we do not dare to dawdle. The sound of the horn, the sound of rapid footsteps in the whole building, everyone desperately running downstairs, unlike the previous situation. We all know that the midnight assembly is not a joke anymore, and that the main instructor, Michael, is still down there. Michael looked at his wristwatch. This time it was obviously much faster than last time. And everyone's dress code was still looking good. Well, in the eyes of a man like Michael, who leads a special unit, this group of people who are more than new recruits, they are not only passable, but the 3 squad leaders have done their best, and they've done their best. Michael said to the 3 squad leaders, "Well, good." The crowd breathed a mental sigh of relief and waited for Michael's next order. They have been in military training for nearly a month, they have not yet been to the field exercise. Today is the first time to gather in the middle of the night. It is estimated that the field exercise cannot be escaped. A moment perhaps they have to let them go up to pack their luggage at. Unexpectedly Michael hung his head slightly. He looked at his watch. 2 o'clock in the middle of the night. Not early enough. To's not an instructor who likes to torture people, and all the training is designed to produce a more solid and capable soldier to defend our country. He thought for a moment and said to the crowd, "At ease, attention." Dismissed. The cheers filled the air, drowning out the rain. Go back and get some rest, he admonished. Everyone didn't expect the thrilling midnight assembly to go by like this, and they felt a lot more good about Michael, the instructor. Soo-mi-yeon pulled Sophia with one hand and Ivy with the other towards the upstairs, and said with some emotion, "Scared me to death, schoolmate. I thought Michael was going to pick on you again. You didn't get into a fight with him just now, right?" Ivy was distracted. "No." Sophia laughed. "Ivy has not barred. It is something to say. She thinks everyone is afraid of Michael, but Ivy is never afraid. It is magical. The clothes on the body are all wet, but a few people are not in the mood to take a shower. Again, after all, at 6 o'clock in the morning to get up in the morning, which is not enough to sleep for 4 hours, it took a lot of time for everyone to change out of their wet clothes, blow dry their hair, and wash and rinse, and Ivy casually wiped her face in front of the sink, scrubbed her rain-soaked hair a little, and went to bed. Early the next morning, everyone was busy getting dressed and going down to train, but Ivy, who was usually always on time, suddenly slacked off. Soo-mi-yeon and Sophia went to the bed and called out to Ivy, and after half a day's shouting, she said somewhat wanly, "I don't want to remember, let me sleep a little longer." She was seldom in such a condition, and spoke in a slurred voice. That Sophia and Soo-mi-yeon looked at each other, and then at Ivy. Ivy's white face was flushed, as if it were on fire, and Sophia instantly pressed her hand to Ivy's forehead, which rolled alarmingly hot, and Ivy's got a fever. Soo-mi-yeon was not as steady as Sophia, and she panicked the first time she encountered this situation. Ivy was so burnt out and disoriented that she wasn't even sure what was going on around her anymore, and Soo-mi-yeon said to Sophia, "What to do, what to do, what to do, what to do now, we'll soon be assembled." Sophia reached out and probed Ivy's head again to make sure that this was a fever. Then she said to Soo-mi-yeon, "You go down to the assembly first, report to the squad leader, I'll be here to take care of Ivy." The Soo-mi-yeon fixed his mind. organized the clothes on his body, hurriedly ran and because of this incident, Soo-mi-yeon was the latest to go down. Jack saw Soo-mi-yeon running over and asked with some displeasure. Why did you come over just now? Didn't you hear the whistle of the assembly? Soo-mi-yeon's heart is aggravated. Report, Ivy has a fever. Jack then noticed that only Soo-mi-yeon had come. Ivy and Sophia, who often appeared with Soo-mi-yeon, had not come over. Michael was standing at the head of the 3 squad lines, and Jack ran over to report to Michael that the Michael didn't catch it at first and asked, "Who are you saying has a fever?" Report, Ivy. Michael frowned and said in a deep voice, "You guys continue to train, I'll take her to the infirmary." After he finished, he didn't wait for Jack to respond, he lifted his feet and took a big stride up the dormitory stairs. The door to the dormitory where Ivy was half hidden. Michael raised his hand and knocked on the door, hearing a police come in from inside before he lifted his foot and walked in. Sophia took care of Ivy, and saw that it was actually the main instructor, Michael, who had come, and for a moment she was a little nervous, and didn't know what to say. Michael reached out to lift Ivy's covers, and halfway through, his hand suddenly paused at the sight of Ivy's sharp clavicle and pale skin. If it had been in the past, with the relationship between the two of them, naturally, it would have been fine, but now, off to the side, Sophia's gaze gazed at Michael's hand, and he was instantly that little bit unnatural. He coughed softly. "You help her get dressed, I'll wait outside." Sophia helped Ivy put on her coat, afraid of Ivy catching a cold. Not only put on her usual military training uniform, but also find out the big cotton jacket brought over before and draped it over the most outside. Although it is not the season to wear a cotton jacket, but the set is always warmer. Michael slung the man onto his back and hurried downstairs, Sophia following, and the way from the dormitory to the infirmary was not far and not too close. If one were to walk there alone, naturally there would be no problem, but Michael was carrying an Ivy dressed like a bear. Sophia looked a little worried, but a few minutes later, she felt that her worry was superfluous. Michael carried Ivy down the stairs, uphill and downhill and around the corner, with a steady step, and without a gasp. It was only at this point that Sophia realized that Michael had always been quite reliable, and although everyone had always feared him, he had been able to solve any problems during the military training process. Today's infirmary duty is still Dr. Luo. See, Michael came over again. Heart strange, Michael recently came to the infirmary quite often. She looked at Michael's back. Yo, this is not the girl who came the other day, right? Michael said to Dr. Rowe. Dr. Rowe, here to trouble you, again. Dr. Rowe, looking at Ivy's face, understood that it was a fever, and told Michael to hurry up and put the man to bed. Dr. Luo went to get a thermometer, casually asked, how to have a fever again, thinking that this delicate little girl is not easy, was sent here to train, and was stabbed by barbed wire, and fever, the back do not know what to go through, Sophia said as she followed Dr. Rowe. This morning when we woke up we noticed that Ivy wasn't right, and then I probed her forehead and it felt like she had a fever, probably. Sophia's eyes went to Michael, and she wasn't sure if she should say that. Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose and spoke with rare embarrassment, probably because of last night's emergency muster. Dr. Luo understands, last night it rained so heavily, Michael even let the foreign ministry of these cadets emergency assembly. This is not destroying, this one has not been a soldier. Young girls and boys, Dr. Rowe said, somewhat helplessly, to Michael, you Ivy didn't burn too badly, and understood what the fever was from, which made it easier to deal with. Dr. Rowe suggested giving Ivy a hangnail and prescribing some cold medicine. Michael had no objections, and Sophia somehow always felt that Michael looked at Ivy with more concern than she, who lived in the same dormitory as Ivy, did. Thinking back to some of the friction that had occurred between Ivy and Michael since the military training, Sophia experienced some other meanings. She suddenly felt that there should be nothing more for her here, and called Michael and said that she wanted to go back to training, and Michael agreed to that. After Sophia left, Michael pulled up a stool and sat right on the edge of Ivy's bed, looking at her delicate face without moving a muscle. The Ivy originally had a goose-egg face, perhaps because of the really hard training she had been doing for the last month. Her chin was getting pointier and pointier, the apple part of her face was flushed from the fever like the evening sky, while the rest of her face looked very pale from the fever, and her lips were dry from the high fever. And Michael took a cotton swab from the table, dipped it in water, and pressed it to Ivy's lips. He suddenly sighed. July, don't scare me, why is this body of yours still so bad? I don't know if Ivy heard it or not, but she fluttered her eyelashes slightly, like a butterfly fluttering its wings, and it was Michael's job to make them assemble for training in the rainy night, and even though he couldn't see the girl suffer, much less get sick, he had never been meticulous when it came to his own job. What's more, the girl had chosen a difficult path, and when he had rescued her from the fire that day, he couldn't imagine how such a tender girl had managed to live for 3 years in that war-torn land. With that in mind, Michael wondered when Ivy opened her eyes and Xiaoshuan brother, Ivy cried out, and only after she made the sound did she realize that her voice was particularly hoarse, so hoarse that it was a little hard to hear. Michael came out of his musings, his gaze fixed on her face, his voice rising slightly. Ivy didn't expect Michael to answer himself. Sick people are always vulnerable, and there were a few moments of sourness, a few moments of happiness, and a few inexplicable emotions that she couldn't say. Her hand was a little limp, but she raised it tremblingly, and hooked Michael's hand, which hung at his side, with her little finger. Michael let her move in a rare moment. Xiaoshuan brother, Ivy shouted again, not caring if her voice was hard to hear or not. What's going on? Michael asked. I'm sorry. Ivy's tears barreled down her face, and Michael's heart throbbed as he watched. Michael hastily took the paper on the bedside table and carefully wiped Ivy's tears, usually not quite so dejected. Ivy shook her head desperately. I really didn't mean to mess up in the training. I was just afraid that you really didn't want me anymore. I just wanted to get your attention. I didn't mean to not dress properly in the middle of the night yesterday when we assembled. It was because I was really in a hurry. And I wasn't faking my fever. I didn't want to have a fever, and I didn't want to have a fever. Michael was somehow amused, yet more heartbroken by the girl, as he hadn't realized that his actions had caused her so much mental stress, and he patted her hand, holding it in a counter grip. That I didn't say you did it on purpose. Get well. Michael was an attentive man. He noticed that Ivy's voice was a little hoarse, and added, I'll get you some water. Don't move, you're still on the shot. And Ivy, in a rare moment of good behavior, nodded her head like a little bunny. Michael brought Ivy some water and helped her up. Sitting half against the pillows, Ivy took a sip of water and was about to say something when she heard Michael's cell phone ring. Michael picked up the phone, not knowing what was being said on the other side of the line, and his face became a little heavy. After a while, Michael said, I can't get away for a bit right now, and then hung up the phone. And Ivy looked at the water in her hand, then at the medicine that was dripping so slowly, and said, Am I holding you up? And Michael denied it. Don't think too much about it. He looked at Ivy moping and changed the subject. What do you want for lunch? The Ivy was just about to shake her head when Michael volunteered, whether it was red meat with potatoes or chili chicken nuggets. Ivy looked petite, but not so picky when it comes to eating. Also love meat. Ivy's mood is better, said both, and Michael said yes. At lunchtime, just 10 minutes after Ivy's hangnail had been administered, Jack brought over his meal. Still feeling a little embarrassed at watching the two sit harmoniously in the infirmary, the Ivy smiled back at Jack, embarrassed. It's rare to see Ivy like this. Jack smiled and scratched his head and said, Chief of Staff, I've got some business to attend to, so I'll leave you to it. The two of them just ate their meal in silence. The picture was very harmonious, during which Ivy repeatedly assured Michael that she would train well afterward. Michael loses his smile. Didn't you train well before? Don't think too much, eat well. I told you I'd train with you. A bright smile raised on Ivy's face. It was the second time Michael had said something like that, and although he hadn't picked it out, she knew his personality and what it meant when he said it. For a moment, her mood was as if it was the first day after the rain, and even the discomfort in her body eased a lot. After lunch, Michael, seeing that Ivy was still quite weak, insisted on carrying her back on his back. Ivy started to squirm a little, but Michael insisted, and with both arms outstretched he slung the man onto his back and out of the infirmary. In the morning Michael was so intent on getting Ivy to the infirmary quickly that he didn't think of anything else, but now that Ivy was lying softly on his back, he suddenly felt some inexplicable stirring in his heart. Michael felt a little amused with himself. Ivy lying on his back, thought of once upon a time he was also like this, often carry their own. Just this once upon a time has been a long time ago. Think of it are a little fuzzy. Ivy rested her head against his neck, and for a moment she actually felt warm. The muscles in his body were hard, but they gave her an infinite sense of security. She guessed that she would never fall in love with any other man in her life except for him. In the blink of an eye, we were at the bottom of the dormitory building. Ivy's fingertips nudged Michael's shoulder. just put me down, I can get up. They're on my own. Michael's tone took on a bit of a smirk, and without letting go, Ivy punched him on the shoulder. Put me down. What if I put you down and you fall to the ground halfway? I'm not that stupid. The pout that carried in her voice was so natural that even she didn't realize that. Michael grunted softly. I'd better send you back before you fall again and delay the training afterward. The Ivy so burned. A series of 3 days and a hangnail to be considered good, after the good people are also a little breathless. Despite following the training with everyone, but a lot of projects still can only sit in the sun and watch everyone train. So Ivy fully carry out the spirit of lay phone, from time to time to give everyone a water, take a clothes, but also sell to cheer, so save a lot of popularity. For a time, Ivy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the old team members and the new team members are considered to have a few status. Michael naturally saw those little moves of Ivy's, and didn't care much. Let her do what's harmless. A few nights ago, when Ivy was videoing Olivia about being sick, Olivia was all of a sudden so anxious that she kept yelling in the video that she was going to go back to her country soon, and when she did, she'd come over here to see her. Ivy was breathless and flopped down on the bed. Don't come, it's a month away, I'll see you when military training is over. The Olivia was not having it, she wanted to come. And Ivy didn't argue with her. Looking at the blue sky on the training ground, Ivy thought to herself, I don't know when this girl will come, it's a question whether she can get into this camp when she comes. Olivia doesn't care. Who is she? Does Andrew know her for nothing? If she can't even get into the camp, how can she be called Olivia? The newest exercise was grenade throwing, and Ethan and Oliver's 2 classes of cadets were so excited about it, and their 2 classes were all boys, and they all wanted to do it as soon as possible, and they were so excited about it. Jack's class was not so optimistic. A group of girls heard that they had to throw a grenade. They were scared and backed away, but some things cannot be solved by backing away. Jack tilted up a sunburned ruddy red face, serious and earnestly holding a grenade, explaining to the whole class of girls about the structure and usage of the grenade. The girls in the class found it too difficult and wanted to conjure up a book and pen to write it down. Even the ever-steady Sophia was a little flustered. Sumian looked at Ivy. Seeing Ivy as calm as ever, Sumian asked curiously, Sister Ivy, will you be able to? Ivy didn't shake her head, she didn't nod. Okay, she'd thrown before. Once upon a time John had taken her on a grenade throw. Couldn't say it was a good throw I guess, but at least she wouldn't hurt herself. The Sumian sniffed, her eyes lit up with great admiration. Jack finished his speech. Asked who would like to come out to try first, watching the other 2 classes of boys have voted one after another, and voted pretty well, but no one in his class. Girls are willing to come forward. Jack had a serious face, but Ivy could see a bit of helplessness in his seriousness. Everyone was not cooperating. How was this job going to work? The Ivy thinks about it and says, report, I'll. People didn't realize the first person to come forward was Ivy. Ivy is an old member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She applied to go abroad as soon as she joined the ministry 3 years ago, and in the eyes of this group of new members of the ministry, she can be said to be very stubborn and courageous. The Jack thinks for a moment and asks, is there anyone else? That another person came out of the line in a mischievous manner, and it was none other than Xingyu. Xingyu faced with some determination, and Ivy's light-hearted different. She said I go that look as if to compete with Ivy, that the place where the bombs were dropped was about 300 meters away from them, and Jack gave them both a grenade each, and had another skirmisher follow the 2 of them towards the place where the bombs were dropped. Michael has just come down from the training ground of the Special Brigade. Today's practice is parachuting. For mature veterans of the Special Brigade, it is considered a basic subject, and Michael is more than satisfied. He first went to the 2 squads led by Ethan and Oliver to look at the 2 squads. Although the technique of throwing grenades is not good, but they are all positive and enthusiastic. When we got to the class that Jack was leading, the mood dropped immediately, and seeing Jack standing there with a difficult look on his face, he asked, what's wrong? Jack reported truthfully that no one had gone, and that all thought it dangerous to drop bombs, and went to Michael asked which 2. Jack took a careful look at Michael's face. Thankfully it didn't stink. If he had been in the recruiting company, Michael would have reprimanded the pile of men surrounding him, as well as him. By now Ivy, Xingyu. Michael subconsciously flinched and Jack hastened to add, sending a man to follow that. Michael nodded, knowing that when he finished speaking, he headed that way without thinking. and saw them in camouflage uniforms from afar, Ivy being slightly taller, and Xingyu being a bit more petite. Having led so many days of military training, it wasn't as if Michae couldn't see that the two had been at odds. He could see that Ivy didn't care about Xingyu, but Xingyu seemed to have a big problem with Ivy. The Michae, walking fast, soon caught up with the two men, and was guarding one of the girls with the soldier who had followed him. He didn't follow Ivy too closely, being a slight distance away from her. The Ivy was holding the grenade in her hand, and it would be a lie to say she wasn't nervous. After all, the power of the thing and the sound of the blast was kinda scary, so she didn't really have the energy to pay attention to anything else, not realizing that Michae was right behind her at the moment. The Ivy and Xingyu arrived at the field where the bombs were to be dropped almost at the same time. Ivy pulled the fuse and dropped the bombs in preparation for the run, as Jack had taught her. Michae looked at Ivy's movements are still smooth, slightly put down his heart. At least it is also a girl who grew up in the compound. Even if you have not eaten pork, how have seen a pig run? But just as Ivy dropped the bomb and turned back to run, Michae saw what seemed to be a pause in her movements. Michae couldn't think fast enough and quickly ran over to Ivy, yanking the person into his arms as he and with that, Ivy fell into Michael's chest, which burned like a furnace. The Michae pulled Ivy a few steps out, counting on the grenade going off, and immediately pressed Ivy's head into his arms before the two of them crouched on the ground. With a bang, yellow ash filled the sky, and Ivy was just about to get up when there was another loud bang, and Michae hurriedly held the men down again, pressing them into his arms, their eyes, mouths, and noses full of yellow ash, the smell of smoke in the air, and Ivy's heart was pounding like a drum. The sound of two grenades blowing up was just horrible, reminding her of those 3 years in Afghanistan when she heard sounds like that all the time. She was trembling a little in Michael's arms, though I don't know how long it took, but the smell of smoke finally cleared a bit, and Ivy looked up, confused, at Michae, looking a bit pathetic. Ivy explained to Michae that somehow her foot had suddenly cramped up just now. Michae looked serious, his jaw taut and his lips pursed tightly. The Ivy thought she was going to be reprimanded again, and Michae opened his mouth, but didn't half want to reprimand, seeing that, knowing he couldn't do it, and playing the hero. "The who says I can't," said Ivy, reaching out and touching Michael's hand, curtly, "and I'm fine, right?" Michae thought to himself that if he hadn't followed him, something might have gone terribly wrong. He felt Ivy in his arms, still trembling a little, fragile and a little afraid of Ivy. In fact, is rarely seen. Michae knows the soft side of her heart, her face again strong, stubborn, but in the end as a girl, encounter things will panic, will be afraid, only she habitually hide their own this panic and fear. The Michae patted Ivy, reassuringly. It's okay, it's not scary." The Ivy calmed down under his comforting presence. "Does your foot still hurt? Does it still cramp? Can you walk?" Ivy slowed down, moved her legs, looked at Michae with difficulty. "And it still hurts a little." Her tone was petulant and made Michael's heart ache involuntarily. He stood up first, then pulled her. "I'll carry you." The two had been flopping around on the ground for so long that they had forgotten about the other two, and Michae had just pulled Ivy to her feet when he saw the two standing in front of them. What happened just now made Xingyu also a little frightened. The pallor on her face had not yet faded, but when she looked at these two people here to make love to each other, her eyes were more exasperated. "Michae, is it because of Ivy that you came over here?" The Ivy didn't say a word, staring blankly at Michae as Michae frowned, a little impatiently to Xingyu. "In any other cadet, I would have followed over." "It's my duty to," Xingyu retorted. "Clearly not, you just care about Ivy. You just favor her." Michae pulled Ivy toward his back and said to Xingyu, "In a bad mood, this is in the army, who allows you to talk to the chief like that?" He's carrying Ivy on his back towards Jack. Jack, having heard the explosion on this side, and having seen the two men in ambush, was also running this way. Jack was relieved to see that several people had come out, and were not injured, or this would have been a big deal. Without waiting for Jack to say anything, Michae said, "Ivy's got a cramp in her foot, she'll be out of practice this afternoon, just have her watch from the sidelines." With Ivy and Xingyu at the vanguard, the girls in the class instantly became active, and one by one, they walked towards the bombing range. Jack, fearing a recurrence of what happened before, had gotten a few more people to watch and keep a closer eye on him than he had before. Ivy was sitting in the shade of a tree, and Michae stood beside her in a straight posture. This person casually to stand there, like standing military posture, straight like a poplar. Ivy thought about it, lifting the watery eyes to ask, "You just said to zing you those are serious, in exchange for whoever you will go over." The Michael thought about it and nodded. It was his duty, only if it had been someone else. I'm afraid his heart wouldn't have been so torn up about it. 3 years, how many days and nights, she appeared in his dreams. She was his pillar of support through the difficult times, when he fought with criminals, when he was seriously injured in the hospital, when he was unconscious. His mind was all about her. She was the only one in his mind. 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 He had tried to forget, but he couldn't let go, couldn't forget. What could he do? She came back and stood in front of him. He still wanted her, but he was afraid. This girl who was like a shrinking violet when something happened ran away again. What should he do? Michael snorted. When did he become so afraid of the future? He thought, better to wait. And Chapter 5. The master instructor and the prick. As soon as Olivia returned home, she dragged David to the unit Michael was in, and when they arrived, Ivy had just finished running 3 kilometers, huffing and puffing. Jack was timing the people in his class who hadn't run yet, and Michael just stood and watched. Olivia was anxious, came up and said, "Michael, Andrew gave me that you will take care of Sister Ivy. You just take care of it," said. She also pulled aside Ivy. "July sister, you also said that he's quite good. Where is this good?" The cadets looked dumbfounded. Who was this woman who dared to be mean to their cold-faced Michael? Jack had said before that anyone who finished the run could take a half-hour break and come back to the assembly when the point was reached. Olivia didn't wait for Ivy to say anything, pulling her towards the outside of the training grounds. David has been standing next to Michael, at this time saw the 2 girls left. He went up and patted Michael's shoulder. "Michael, these years you are not easy. Ivy may not be easy. What can be in the past will be in the past." The 2 of them spoke so quietly that onlookers couldn't hear what they were saying, and were only a little curious as to the relationship between the men. Xingyu also finished her run and watched the interaction of these people from the side, muttering, "Shame on you. It's all about connections." Olivia pulled Ivy, kept asking her how she was doing recently, in fact, Ivy's recent situation. The 2 of them had already talked about pretty much in the video, but Olivia was still heartbroken about Ivy. Ivy showed Olivia her face and then her arms. "Look, I'm fine. I'm white. It's that bear you gave me." Michael took it when he checked the dorms the other day. Olivia grunted in disbelief. Her impression of Michael had been poor to the end since that incident happened 3 years ago. "Sister July, don't hang yourself on that tree. I think the boys in your department are fine. The ones who trained just now were all in good spirits. What's so good about Michael's stinking soldier?" Ivy laughed softly, knowing that Olivia had always loved to hate and didn't argue. Said Michael was a smelly soldier, and whoever came out of their compound didn't have a few smelly soldiers in their family, but she just loved Michael, and she did 3 years ago, and she still does, 3 years later. Olivia was talking to Ivy, while she was digging out a lot of food from her small bag. "July, try this, I brought it back from outside, it's delicious. David and I bought you a lot of snacks, they are in his car. I'll ask him to bring them to the dormitory for you later," she said. Ivy took the things in Olivia's hand, and at first glance felt that Olivia was really childish. Dried fruit, lollipops, all small snacks. She usually didn't eat much snacks, and she was grateful to Olivia for playing outside and still thinking of her. She was grateful in her heart. This time just passing the small supermarket in the army. Ivy sometimes come here to buy some things, but not much to buy, are the daily necessities. Olivia see Ivy is still a little breathless, uncertain. The sun is so sunny, also runs so long, must not be good, so said, "July sister, I'm going to buy you a popsicle." Both of them loved popsicles when they were kids. Ivy didn't eat them much when she got older, but now that she'd just finished her run and was getting hot, and Olivia had mentioned it, Ivy was suddenly in the mood for a popsicle. The 2 walked in together, and after all, it is a small supermarket in the army, the types of popsicles are not so many. Looking around and did not find a particular favorite. "Good thing that the 2 are not particularly picky people. Took 2 of the ice factory that I loved more when I was a child." Olivia grabbed the first to pay the money, and the 2 went outside, and the 2 went out. Ivy licked a mouthful, or the original flavor, just in childhood state of mind is different, then feel not so delicious, but, popsicle cool silk, in this hot weather let Ivy hard also sweet, cool silk. And the two of them were eating popsicles and wandering around the campground. And anyway, it was still early for the rendezvous time that Jack had said it would be. Olivia had never been to this camp where Andrew and Michael were staying, even though she grew up in the compound, and walking around at this time, she didn't think it was as scary as she thought it would be. At least it wasn't the middle of nowhere, and the amenities were relatively complete. And it didn't seem like it would be too much of an aggravation for Ivy. Olivia's finally letting go. Suddenly, a cold voice came from behind the two. Olivia, you were the one who encouraged Ivy to eat the popsicles. Olivia was startled. She had been a little afraid of Michael since she was a little girl, and even though she had always disliked Michael later on, she was still afraid. In her heart of hearts, Ivy stepped in front of Olivia. I'm the one who wanted it. Michael frowned and held out his hand, giving me. Ivy clutched the popsicle tightly in her hand, and looked at him stubbornly. Olivia looked at the two and thought Michael was being really bossy. What's wrong with having a popsicle? She was just about to speak, when she saw David approaching as well, and Michael snapped Ivy's wrist and said to David, "You two turn around by yourself for a while I take her to the infirmary." Before Ivy knew what was going on, she was being dragged towards the infirmary by Michael. She anxiously explained, "It's okay, I'm fine," and he's been dragging her to the infirmary way too often these past few days. Michael clasped Ivy's hand regardless and continued on his way. After all, Ivy is a girl, the power cannot defeat him, only to keep explaining that I am really fine, do not need to go to the infirmary, not just ate a popsicle, right? Michael frowned and said in a cold voice, "It's okay to eat a popsicle just after a run, it's okay to eat a popsicle on your period." Ivy heard him and puffed, "What did you say? Say it again." The both of Michael's sword brows came together and Ivy bright eyes with a smile. "Michael, it seems that you are still unforgettable to me. Even the day of my menstrual period are remembered so clearly." Her tone with a three-part ambiguous, three-part provocative, and there are also some other meanings. After a while, Ivy added, "It's long since been that day. And yet you keep remembering it," and with a few moments of amusement in her heart, and with a more and more reckless look in her eyes at Michael, the fire in Michael's heart suddenly subsided for the most part. Just the way this girl looked at him, it was too unbridled. He let go of her hand, his eyes darkened. "As you think?" The Ivy leaned in closer and chirped, "Well, I'll take that as a yes." Michael's face was solemn, knowing that Ivy did not have her period, and no longer insisted on letting her go to the infirmary, but only said lightly, "In a few days the last subject of the military training will begin, the field pulling. When you pay attention to the safety, do not get injured again." He said it coolly, and there was even less emotion to be heard in his voice, but Ivy knew that he was concerned about her. Ivy's smiling out of the corner of her eye. "I see." Michael added, "Don't go forward with everything if you don't have that." Ivy looked at Michael with a big smile. "I know," and then suddenly came up to him and said shamelessly, "You care about me so much and you're so hung up on me. I'll meet you in your dorm tonight." And Michael rubbed his brow with a little headache. "Don't skin." Ivy's tone was a bit coquettish and seductive. "I didn't have a skin in my game, I was serious." She nodded off and stopped babbling to Michael. "David and Olivia are still waiting for me. The class president said there's an assembly in a few minutes. I'll go first. I'll see you tonight." Oh, Michael looked at her back. Military green camouflage uniform. Her waist was so thin that it seemed as if he could hold it in one hand. He sighed in his heart. What an abrasive little goblin. But this invitation of hers was so beautiful that he couldn't afford to be angry, and he thought hard about it. It seemed that since he was a kid, Ivy had only been like this to him. He hooked his mouth and let out a light laugh. By the time Ivy got back to the training ground, Jack had gotten the men assembled to continue their training. David and Olivia hadn't left, just sat on the edge of the practice field, watching Ivy the whole time. Olivia couldn't help but mutter in a small voice, "So bitter." And Sister July said it wasn't. "It's all that guy's fault." When the afternoon's training was completely over, David and Olivia dragged Ivy, and called Andrew to dinner, and were going to ask Michael to join them, but Michael declined. And they went to another small canteen in the troop to give Ivy a little treat since Ivy came back. Andrew had been a little critical of her, but this time down the road Andrew had treated her much better than he had before. He was like that, cold to everything, and didn't talk much at the dinner table, and left after dinner. Olivia had brought a lot of stuff for Ivy, and took advantage of the after-dinner lull to direct David to move boxes of stuff upstairs to Ivy's dormitory. Ivy looks at David as if he's moving, and asks Olivia what it's all about. Olivia whispers to Ivy, "In addition to the little snacks I bought out there, There's a few online purchases I thought you'd like, so I brought them all. Though Olivia was a child, her heart had always been in the right place, and Ivy smiled, looking at David's busy figure, thinking that none of these things would escape being put away by Michael. David made several trips up and down the stairs, but finally finished moving the things. Ivy looked at the time. It is time to continue training in the evening assembly point. The three of them went downstairs together, and Ivy dropped David and Olivia off at the camp's gate, waving goodbye to them. Olivia looked at Ivy reluctantly, but it was David who narrowed his foxy eyes and smiled as he said goodbye to Ivy before dragging Olivia into the car as soon as she was gone. Ivy laughed helplessly. David and Olivia were such a happy couple. The evening training tasks were relatively easy. Most of the time Jack just had the guys run a few laps, do a set of military boxing, occasionally taught them to sing a few military songs, and we all sat down for a bit of a joke and to show off our talents. The Ivy was absent-minded for the whole night. Even Sue Mian, a person with a big personality, could see that Ivy had actually been thinking in her heart about what she had joked with Michael during the day, saying that she would go to the dormitory to look for him, and then whether she would go or not go when it was over. In a while, Ivy has always been my own way, to this time but torn up. To go seems to be a bit frivolous, not to go seems to appear to be a bit timid. She is a bit timid. Ivy didn't know what to do anymore, looking up at Jack with a frown on her face. The Jack was wondering in his mind, was this prick getting ready to screw up again? It was hard to get to the end of the training. Ivy stood up and patted her squatting numb thighs, hesitated for a moment, and slowly said to Sophia and Sue Mian, I'll turn around outside for a while before I go back. You guys go back first. The military training this more than a month. Sue Mian and Sophia more or less understand. Ivy seems to be very familiar with the people in here, so they no longer ask more questions. First go back. The Ivy turned away with mixed feelings. And Michael has a meeting tonight.